All right, I think I'm going to get started now. So welcome and hello, everyone. It's so nice to have you here today and taking the time out of your day or night to be here. My name is Matthew Putland. I'm a senior digital accessibility consultant from the digital access team at Vision Australia. Firstly, Vision Australia acknowledges Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first Australians and the traditional owners of the land across our working area. We pay our respects to elders both past, present, and future in maintaining their cultures, countries, and their spiritual connection to the lands and waters. Vision Australia acknowledges and respects the genuine diversity and richness of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures across Australia. Just before we get started, just some of the housekeeping to get through. So Alex, he's going to be presenting today. His presentation will run for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, including questions you may have sent through during registration for this webinar. But you also have the opportunity to post questions during the presentation. So if you have any for Alex, you can post them using the Q&A button. That is down the bottom of your screen. You should see a little button there that says Q&A. That's where we would like for you to post your questions. We also have live transcripts and captions running. So if you look down the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be what is probably, I hope, a live transcript button. And next to that, you should be able to show the subtitles if they aren't already coming up for you. There's also a transcript button in there so you can view the transcript of what I'm saying. This webinar will also be provided on the Digital Access YouTube channel with captions as well. So we'll send out a link for that when it's available, and you can share that with people and catch up on some of our past webinars as well. And also please use the chat feature, which I see already some of you doing so, which is awesome. So if you just need help with anything during the webinar, if you're having trouble, or if you'd like to join in on the discussion, please talk in a chat. And with that, we're ready to get started. So today we are joined by Alex Bay, a PDF remediation expert from Tagged PDF. So Alex is going to be taking us through the 5 W's for document accessibility. So with that, I'll hand it over to Alex, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt. Allow me just to share my screen. I'd like to just echo Matt's welcome and acknowledgement of country. So today I'm going to be trying to keep things relatively straightforward, relatively simple, and we're going to be taking a look at what I am affectionately calling the 5 W's for document accessibility. The first one that we're going to start off with is who benefits from accessible documents? And this is one of those questions that I get asked, and I sometimes have trouble answering straight away, just because I sort of anticipate that it should be a given thing. So the easiest recommendation for who benefits the most from accessible documents is anybody who has a print disability. So when we're talking about a print disability, we are essentially talking about anything that stops you from accessing printed materials. So if you had a printed material in front of you, such as a pamphlet or a book, the kinds of things that are going to stop you from accessing that material are going to generally fall into the following 3 categories. So the first one is vision. So if you have trouble seeing what is on a page, then it's going to be very difficult for you to understand that material. Obviously, if you can't see the material, you are going to need to rely on somebody else to read it out for you, or to be able to access it in another format. So by creating accessible digital documents, we are providing people with the opportunity to access that material in another way, rather than just relying on the visual side of things. Our second big group is cognitive. So anything that's going to impact someone's ability to understand the material. So this could be something as simple as picking up a printed material that is written in a language that you don't speak. It's very hard to double tap on a book and tell Google to translate it when there isn't Google running in your book. So something like content being in a different language, or having a word that you don't necessarily understand, whether that be due to the level of language in the document, or whether that be due to a lower reading level on the participant, due to age, or due to any other cognitive factor. So there are a massive array of different cognitive elements that can impact someone's ability to understand content. And when we are providing that content in a digital space, there is far more opportunity for people to search out more information. And ultimately, when we're talking about content being accessible, the main thing that we are looking for is for people to have access to that information. So if the information that is provided in a particular format doesn't work for that person, for whatever reason, then they need to have the ability to go somewhere else. And being on a digital device, whether it be a computer or a smartphone, as the two primary methods, it's going to be a lot easier to try and access that information in that one standard place. And finally, if we're looking at physical, it's often overlooked when people are talking about print disability. But we need to remember that if someone has difficulty physically lifting a book or turning a page, then printed material is going to be more difficult to consume. So those are our three main groups, but we also need to consider that a print disability can be both permanent as well as being temporary. So we encounter a number of temporary disabilities almost exclusively throughout the day. So you could have something as simple as there being a bit of glare on your screen, or if you're having low battery or low contrast, it may be difficult to see material on your phone at any given time. That doesn't mean that you would traditionally be considered as having a visual disability, but in that instance, you can't see whatever it is you're trying to look at, and we need to cater for those temporary disabilities as well. So you might be in a busy room and you can't hear a video where normally you could. You might have your hands full trying to cook, where you would normally flick through the pages of a recipe book. You might have an injury, you might have recently had surgery. There are so many different times where the traditional ways that people think about consuming content might be different. And as our technology improves, and as there are more options available for how we consume content, we need to make sure that if we are providing documents, that those documents are available to be able to work alongside those different delivery methods. So that brings us nicely into our next main topic, which is what makes a document accessible. So we have three primary areas that are going to impact the accessibility of a document. The first one is going to be our content. So the number one thing of having accessible information is to make sure that your information makes sense. I could be sitting here with my captions and with my screen up and be talking absolute gobbledygook, and you might have as many different ways of accessing that as you like, but it's still not going to make sense if what I'm saying doesn't make sense. So we need to make sure that what we are saying makes sense and that what we are saying is clear. And then we need to ensure that the language we are using to demonstrate that information is appropriate for the audience. So I will, in a moment, look at some of the misconceptions and things that don't actually make a document accessible. But we do occasionally hear that you can't have an accessible document with a high level of language. However, we do need to note that the level of language can be appropriate for the information that we are providing. So as long as we are catering to our audience and making sure that the people that the information is intended for is going to understand the way that we provide the information, then that is going to ensure that that content is indeed accessible. And finally, and I did touch on it a little earlier, there needs to be options for people to get more information. So if the content you are providing is only available in one format and is only available in one way with one point of view, and there is no other way of accessing more information, that's going to make the consumption of that content a lot more difficult, and you're going to alienate people that aren't able to access something in that particular way. So we need to ensure that we provide something as simple as a contact, so that if someone does want more information, or if someone wants to talk to a person or get things in another way, that they can go ahead and do that in a way that is fairly simple. Then once our content itself is accessible, we then need to look at the design and the way that we are providing that information. So a really big one to touch on is going to be sufficient color contrast. So if you have content that does not provide sufficient color contrast, it's going to be very difficult for all users to be able to read that material. If you have a big yellow heading on a white background talking about how you're going to make your content more accessible, the amount of contrast between yellow and white, as I'm sure many of you can understand, is going to be quite low. And it is much harder to read something like yellow text on a white background than it is to read something like black text on a white background. So ensuring that people can actually see what you're saying is going to make it a lot easier to understand what you're saying. Then we need to make sure that the layout of our information is logical. So if we are presenting information in a document format, we need to think about the way that someone is going to read that information and to make sure that they are getting the story that we're trying to tell them. Many times you'll see designed brochures or maybe magazines where there are pull-out quotes or stories in the middle of a page or text that wraps around a picture. And while all of those things are pretty and nice and can make you feel good if you're the one designing the content, ultimately, the whole idea of designing content is for people to read it. And if it is really pretty, but you can't read it, then it's not very good content. I would much rather read something that makes sense, that I know I can either follow down a column or follow across a page or follow in one direction, rather than needing to fight against what I am used to try and find where the next piece of information is. And ultimately, anything that is going to make content more difficult to understand from a layout perspective is inherently going to make it less accessible. Finally, from our design perspective, we need to make sure that there are multiple ways that we are showing complex information, and primarily that is going to be catering around graphs. So in a little bit, I'll be showing a couple of examples of things not to do, and we'll talk a little bit more around those. But in terms of our key information, we want to make sure in particular that we are not relying on color as the only way of providing information. So a comment has just come up from Alan saying about 10% of males are colorblind. So that is definitely something to consider, that there are quite a high proportion of people who will have some level of color blindness. So relying on the classic green equals good and red equals bad when red-green color blindness is the most common form of color blindness, is going to be very difficult to understand for someone who is red-green colorblind, or someone who is having the information read out to them, or someone who is printing a document out in black and white because they want to save their color ink, or 100 other examples of where that information could be misunderstood. So when we are creating graphs, we need to ensure that we add additional visual cues, generally in the forms of patterns and other overlays, so that even if you couldn't tell the difference between two colors, you should have an additional way of telling the difference between the two, in terms of something like a pattern or an outline or an overlay or something else. Then once our design and our content is complete, once we know that anyone who is looking at the document is going to understand what is on there, and anybody who is listening to the information is also going to understand what they are hearing, finally we get to my side of things, which is making sure that the content works with assistive technologies. I'm not going to go into a lot about making sure that the content works with assistive technology. Anything with the word technology in it generally becomes a little bit complex to get too far into. But essentially, what we're looking to do is provide cues for a computer or a phone or another form of screen reader to know how to read that information out to somebody who isn't looking at it. So one of the key things, and I know that a number of people put through a similar piece in their questions, is around how we can provide some information for visual content, such as images and graphs, in the form of alternate text. So for those who aren't aware, alternate text is where we provide a text alternative for what would generally be a visual element. So we are essentially creating something that assistive technology can read out in place of just saying, there's a picture. Now, when we get into the descriptions of images and descriptions of content, one of the most important things to look at in terms of content that doesn't make information fully accessible is providing what we consider to be default alt text, or any text that doesn't actually add value. So on the screen here, I have a picture of a white figure sitting and contemplating on a question mark that is red and is 3D and indicates questions will be coming at this point of the presentation. In reality, the fact that there is a figure sitting on top of the question mark, that the question mark is red, that the figure is white, that the question mark is 3D, all of that information doesn't really add anything to the conversation. I could have simply said, are there any questions? And the fact that the picture is there doesn't actually add any value. However, if I was doing a presentation talking about how descriptive you could be, and we were making it a competition to see how much descriptive information I could put in, then adding in the color of the question mark or adding in the color of the figure, talking about the pose of the figure, are all going to be important. So when we are providing text descriptions, we essentially want to go for what the intention of that image or graph is, and what we are trying to portray by putting that image or graph in. So if I include a photo of a person potentially making a speech, then depending on the context of that, it's going to determine how I describe the person. So if we had a picture of a politician who was shaking hands with somebody, if the whole point of putting that image in was to say that there was reconciliation between the politician and the person they were shaking hands with, then we would write that in the alternate text. If for whatever reason the politician had made their way into a fashion magazine and it was talking about suit jackets, then the alt text description would rely on describing the suit jacket, because that is the context that the image has been placed into. Then we also need to be careful of having documents or trying to create content that is oversimplified. So as I mentioned before, I often see documents where people have tried to use simplified language or easy English and have essentially taken out the main purpose of their information, or have not catered to their audience in an attempt to make the information more accessible, but they have actually removed some of the key information, and it sometimes makes it sound as though you are talking to a different audience, or that the end purpose of that document is not going to necessarily meet what its intended purpose is. Then from a design perspective, we mentioned that an accessibly designed document will ensure that color is not the only way of providing information, and that we need to ensure that we add patterns and that we are using color to help to supplement our message. That doesn't mean that simply adding different colors or making sure you have high contrast or adding patterns to a graph is going to magically make it accessible. Now, this is an example that I came across once before. And if I was to ask anyone in the audience to describe this graph to somebody who couldn't see it, I would be extremely impressed if any of you were able to accurately make sense of a graph like this. This graph was replacing 14 pages of text content, and the author believed that it was easier to place this one graph in rather than have a whole extra 14 pages explaining it. As a general rule, if you are replacing 14 pages of content with one picture, it's very likely that that picture, although it should be worth 1,000 words, is generally not worth 14 pages. So I would argue that trying to condense content as a way of quote unquote simplifying or decreasing the amount of information that people need to read is not necessarily going to be appropriate if the graph itself doesn't make sense, and especially if you were looking to provide that information to somebody who can't necessarily see the graph. I will admit it is a fairly efficient use of space. It's probably as many words and lines as you can fit on a page. There is a little bit of space up in that top corner, so they could probably get some more international drivers. But I'm sure the next time I work with them, they may have increased that space. All right, so then we get to our next major question, which is, when are documents the right format to use? So what the big thing to keep in mind, and yes, as a document specialist, I do still say this, HTML is the gold standard for accessible communication. And the biggest reason that HTML is the gold standard for accessible communication is that we need to make sure that accessible and inclusive communication is going to be able to cater to the individual needs of the person trying to access it. Because HTML is such a versatile format, and because the majority of assistive technologies are designed to work directly with HTML, a user is able to adjust the way that HTML content looks in order to make it work for them. We can increase the size of font, we can change the colors, we can change the layout, we can take the same content on a large landscape screen and put it onto a portrait screen, such as a mobile device, and not lose any of that information. However, if there weren't documents around, I probably wouldn't have a job. So documents certainly do have a place in the creation of accessible content. And generally, we would recommend documents being used when there is a need to have them also provided in a print format, or if there is a requirement for everything to look the same. So a lot of legal documentation, a lot of contracts, if you're going to create, say, an annual report or a large format document that is going to be printed and distributed, then it doesn't always make a lot of sense to then try and convert all of that content to an HTML format if you have already created the document. So in that case, you are looking to create an accessible version of that document so that we don't have this whole print version and accessible version being two different versions of a document. We are instead looking to create one version of a document that users are able to access in whatever way they see fit. So they can print it out if they prefer printed content. They can view it on their computer if that's how they want to access it. And they can make sure that that document is going to look the same regardless of whether it is printed, regardless of whether it is viewed in a web browser, if it is viewed on a PC, or if it is viewed on a Mac, or whatever device may come across. The biggest issue for PDF documents is also its biggest strength, which is that PDF documents are designed to be the same across all formats, which means when you take something that should be fitting on traditionally an A4 page and you shrink it down to a phone screen, it's going to be very small in that format, and it's not going to fit the shape of your phone in the same way that HTML content or even Word content can. So anytime that you are looking to distribute content that does not need to be mobile accessible, then PDF is going to be an appropriate format, and Word can also be an appropriate format in that case. And if you are looking to distribute content digitally only, then HTML is going to be your gold standard. However, there is a case for using Word documents as well, especially where there is a need for collaboration, or if there is going to be a number of changes required, either on the case of multiple content authors, or in the case of the audience needing to make changes. So just like in HTML, a content user is able to change the font size, the font color, the layout of a Word document to suit their individual needs in a way that they can't necessarily do for PDF. So creating an accessible Word document almost sits as that middle range to allow more versatility for the user, as well as allowing for a printed format that is going to be relatively standardized, and allows us to have one version of the information that ticks off all of the intended boxes. PDF is also useful if you need to secure your information and ensure that it prints well and is going to look the same across all devices that view it. Then we get to where our accessible documents should be found. And I had to fight really hard to not just put the word everywhere here and then move on. From a legal perspective in Australia, all government-owned or operated or funded websites should be providing any documents in an accessible format. So if you work with an Australian government organisation, regardless of what level of government it is, or if you are doing work that is either funded by any level of government or is going to be mentioned by any level of government, then that information needs to be accessible if it is in a document format. Outside of government regulations, any organization that caters to a diverse audience should be making sure that the information that they provide is accessible. And if they are providing documents, they want to make sure that those documents can be accessed by as many people as possible. So we need to keep in mind that every person you are creating your content for, if you are an organization, let's say a bank, it's not like people who have a print disability don't have money. Just because we don't have paper money doesn't mean that paper is going to be the best way of dealing with those types of communication. So while their key audience may not necessarily be an inclusive audience, anytime that you are catering to everybody, you want to make sure that your information is available to everybody. So anyone who already caters to a diverse audience, or anyone who wants to cater to a diverse audience, and in general, anyone who wants to talk to the public needs to make sure that their information is as easy as possible to get access to. And the easier it is to access, the better people are going to be able to understand what you are saying, and the more likely it is that they're going to engage with you. Which does then bring us into why everyone needs to do their part. So from an Australian perspective, there has been a requirement around producing accessible digital content for 12 years now. However, and I don't mean to make this sound begrudging, but I'm still doing seminars about why we need to make documents accessible, even though this has been around for 12 years. So the reality is that digital information is becoming far more prevalent. There is more information available online and through digital devices than there ever has been. And we need to, if you ever need to sit there and go, why I, as a insert type of person here, need to care about accessible information, there has been a massive boom in what I will jokingly call lazy people who use common technology like Siri and Google Assistant to be able to access information either via audio or through not touching their phone, where they previously would have typed in and physically read the content. So having information that your device knows how to understand and how to give information to is going to be a lot more appropriate, and is going to allow more people to access it than by providing information that can only be accessed by print. Not to mention that we do have a moral obligation to ensure that all members of the community feel as though they are members of the community and can be included in the wider discussion and have access to all important information. I would love to see us get to a point where we don't talk about accessible documents as being accessible documents. They're just documents that happen to be accessible because we don't really provide an inaccessible option. At this point, with the technology that we have, there isn't really any good reason to provide information that we don't optimize as much as we can, and to provide other alternatives for that information to ensure that everybody has access to it in the best way that they can. So I will just quickly finish off with a couple of really simple notes on things that we can do for both Word and PDF documents to ensure that they are as accessible as they can be. And then I will open the floor to questions, and I can see that there's been a few questions that have come through in the chat, as well as some other questions that were provided earlier to make sure that you guys get as much out of this session as you can. So a quick note, when we are creating Word documents, first things first, we want to make sure that we use our styles properly and ensure that we have created styles that are going to be appropriate for what we are intending to do. That generally will include making sure that we have our headings and are using correct heading levels so that users can navigate through content. We want to make sure that we have a linked table of contents for users to move directly to the key piece of information that they're looking for. We want to make sure that our links are explained so that if a user is moving between links, they know what those links are going to take them to, rather than just being a bunch of click here links. We want to use the accessibility checker. As time goes on, the accessibility checker is getting more accurate and more thorough. We want to use those tools to ensure that, that we are doing the best practice that we can. Then we want to make sure that our tables that we provide are simple tables wherever possible. So for a simple table, that means that we don't have multiple headings on a singular axis, and that each cell only relates to one heading per axis without having multiple merged or split cells. And if we are providing large format tables, we want to provide a text description so that users know how they can access that information and decide whether they want to read the whole table or not. Then when we are looking at creating PDFs, we do have a few more things that can be done, but we still need to be aware of making sure that they're done properly. So in the case of PDF, we are able to have complex tables, but I would strongly recommend avoiding complex tables wherever you can. There is a lot of additional work that goes into making a complex table accessible. And when I say a complex table, I'm talking about headings that are merged over multiple rows or multiple columns, or if there are multiple headings in a singular row or a singular column that are all going to impact on a particular piece of content. Then in terms of our alternate text restrictions, so in Word, we do want to minimize the amount of alt text because some third-party readers don't interact with alt text in Word documents very well. Whereas in PDF, we do have a larger ability to write more alt text. That being said, it is still better to provide a fairly concise amount of alt text. We don't want to waffle on, and we want to make sure that users are able to get the information that they need from that image and then move on to the next piece. Our color contrast rules still apply in PDF, just like they do in Word. We need to be aware that most programs will still need to export a document and then do some additional external tagging. And I am yet to see any publication software that is able to export a fully accessible document with no need for changes. Then, if my earlier image didn't represent it, I strongly recommend avoiding flowcharts. The only time that I would entertain a flowchart is if it has what I like to call the choose your own adventure, where someone can choose either yes or no and move in different directions, because that is an easy way to follow that information. But we still need to provide that information in a text-based format so that someone can navigate through that information. Then, of course, we need to still ensure that we have the clear link descriptions and set up our table of contents properly, just like we would in Word. So that is the 5 W's, as I am calling it for now. So I have noticed that a few questions have come through both on the Q&A section and a few items on the chat. So Matt, did you have a hierarchy of where people got their questions answered, or will we just go?
Yeah, so we're just going to go jump from the Q&A to the registration questions. Sure. So we're just going to start with the first one from Alan, which I can actually answer. Would you comment on accessible fonts? In fact, just the previous webinar we did was all about accessible typography. So I can actually link that in the chat for everyone to go check out that previous webinar. So that was a deep dive on accessible typography that could answer it in a lot more detail than what we could here. But Alex, do you have anything to comment on accessible fonts?
So just really our general rules around it. So ideally, we want to stick to sans serif fonts over serif fonts. Is probably the biggest and easiest one to do. Then from a designer perspective, we want to stay away from things like ligatures. So anything that's going to impact the legibility of the content. Ligatures, for those who don't know, is where 2 characters that get very close to each other will be joined. So something like a double T that shares a stroke will occasionally not be read properly by a screen reader, and it will only recognize the first character. But otherwise, anything that's going to impact on the clarity or the shape of the letters. So italics, underlining, anything that distorts from the words is going to make the content more difficult to understand.
Excellent, thanks, Alex. Going through the questions from registration, we got one here from Sarah Gerber in WA. What are the best online resources to learning about accessible documents?
That is a difficult question depending on what you're trying to achieve. So if you are working in Word, for example, the Microsoft website has got a lot of functionality around how to make different pieces of information accessible. And I might just bring in the other Q&A question about the accessibility checker in Office while I'm at it. The accessibility checker in Office is a built-in tool that's been available since 2010 that when you are creating a document, it will essentially outline any issues that people may have difficulty accessing your information. It will highlight the piece of content. It will explain to you why that particular thing is a problem. It will then provide you with step-by-step instructions of how to fix that particular problem. So for Word in particular, basically everything that you need to know is all going to be in that program. Or when you click to learn more, it will take you through to the Microsoft website, which is going to show you all of the functionality that Microsoft Word has. When we're looking at accessible design from a PDF perspective, it's very much going to depend on the types of documents that you are looking to create. There are a lot of useful videos online that will show specific things. But because there's such a wide array of different pieces of information that we want to show in documents, it's really hard to point to one source that's going to have everything that you need, unfortunately. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job.
Thanks for that, Alex. Just checking out the chat, see if there's any other questions. Kate in the chat asked, what is the barrier, Alex, to organizations creating accessible info? And what about SpeakReader, which I presume was ReadSpeaker, the online sort of text-to-speech tool?
So the biggest barrier that we have encountered is just breaking old habits. I think that print documents have been around for so long, and designers are so ingrained in creating what appears to be, pretty design, or the most concise way of presenting information, trying to fit as much as you can on a page, or trying to cover as much ground as you can in as short a time as possible, that thinking about how to cater to an audience that isn't your traditional audience can sometimes be a difficult slump to get out of. And I think that the other difficulty is just around representation. We don't have a really strong representation of people with lived experiences of disabilities, whether they be temporary or permanent, that are making things front of mind. And one of the biggest catalysts for people improving their internal accessibility, that I hear at least, is someone saying, oh, such and such director has insert requirement here, so now we're realizing that maybe we should do it. And so a lot of the time, organizations will wait until they know someone who has low vision, therefore needs a screen reader, or someone who is deaf, therefore they need text-based content, rather than just realizing that we are trying to cater to everybody. So it's a bit of a difficult question, but the biggest barrier that I see is just breaking out of what we've been doing for too long. And the longer you do it, the harder it is to break out of it.
Thank you, Alex. I got a question coming in from Asker from Education Tasmania. We've got a question from your registration also in the QA. I think they're related. So we got Adobe has a native feature, reading order, that often shows page reading order than tags. I've checked with NVDA Screen Reader, and tag order is what NVDA takes under consideration. Should we take notice of this native reading order feature? Is it valid for some assistive technology? If yes, for what? And yeah, the question Q&A goes on to sort of ask about what is the reading order in Acrobat Pro 4?
So it's a little bit of a difficult question because as you've identified on the surface, there isn't a lot of purpose of the reading order itself. The reading order is linked to the layering of content. And if you look at something like Microsoft PowerPoint, the way that PowerPoint works out reading order is based on the layers of information. You'll also find that if you change the reading order in a particularly complex document, that it will actually change the visual layers of the content on the page. And you may find that things disappear behind backgrounds, or where you start to have paths dropping off is generally where the reading order would come in. The short answer for why we have it is because it has been there a lot longer than tags have. And in Acrobat Pro in particular, the built-in reader in Acrobat Pro does use the reading order. It doesn't use the tags, even though that's the program that you would use to create tags. It's also worth noting that nobody uses the built-in screen reader in Acrobat Pro, because if you need a screen reader, you'll need to have it open to get to Acrobat Pro, in which case you're not going to turn a different one on. I don't want to turn this into an Adobe bagging session, but it's not the most useful thing in the world. However, there are still some basic readers that will use the reading order in place of the tags, and they will generally be simplified things like the built-in read out loud function that don't actually take tags, but most of the most prominent screen readers will rely on tags, and they will be looking at the tag order over the reading order.
Thanks, Alex. I didn't know that either. That's good to know. Another question from Frida Lee. Thank you so much, Alex and Matt. This has been so helpful. It's really useful to know that flowcharts are not accessible. I wonder what you think about other infographics that we think might help be easier to understand for some people trying to understand pages of info, for example, a comic. Is it best to both use an infographic and describe it, or not use infographics at all?
So there's nothing wrong with using infographics as long as the information is clear. And the way that I generally will explain it to people is, if you imagine that you are talking to someone over the phone, if you were just reading what's on the page without providing any other context, does what you're saying make sense? If you're relying on something like a comic strip to provide additional context to what is actually being said, then you would need to provide a text-based description to cover it. In the same way as if you were providing video content, we can't just have the dialogue. We need to also include descriptions of what's happening in the scene, or things like relations to music or background noise to help provide the full story. So the big problem that I have with infographics that do rely only on the images is that if someone can't see the images, they don't make sense. But if you are providing information that makes sense on its own, and you have a graphic that supplements it, such as a graph sitting next to a table of information, as a really basic example, then that can help to make your information easier to understand for more people without making it more difficult to understand for a particular audience.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Any other questions? I'll take one last look at the list that we did have.
So I did see a comment from Nina that was, I've heard PDFs are not that accessible. Am I wrong about that? And the answer to that is, it depends on what the intention of your information is. So PDFs are not great for mobile because they don't change to mobile in the same way that most other live content does. So even as a fully sighted, fully able-bodied user, trying to access a PDF document on your mobile device is pretty difficult and takes a lot of mucking around. And if you'd had that in an HTML or a live text version, it is a lot easier to use. And as more people move towards consuming content on mobile devices, PDF therefore become less accessible because of the way that people are accessing that information. The other difficulty is that because you do need to put extra work in, and a lot of people don't, there are plenty of members of the community that we talk to through Vision Australia who haven't really experienced that many accessible PDFs, and therefore would prefer not to do it because they know that many people don't do it well. So there's certainly a case for having accessible PDF documents. And if you're going to provide a PDF, you should make it accessible. As I mentioned, it's not the best format, but it is a format, and having an accessible PDF is better than not having an accessible PDF.
Thank you, Alex. Just had a question come through from Jenna, which I can answer as well. Is there a screen reader that is easily available for testing accessibility? So if you have an Apple device, so VoiceOver is built into iOS, so that's iPhones, iPads, and also if you have a Mac, VoiceOver is built in, so you don't actually need to download it. You just need to go into the accessibility settings and you'll find it in there. On Windows, we have Narrator, or you can also use NVDA on Windows, which is a tool that you can download. If you've got an Android device, then you can use a tool called TalkBack, which is also built into Android as well. So all of those ones are free and might already be built into your device, so you don't even need to download anything. But you will probably need to at least go through the tutorial with VoiceOver and TalkBack. There's a tutorial that comes with it, teaches you how to navigate with it. With something like NVDA, I recommend looking up a video. Google Alleycast does a good video on how to use NVDA just for the purposes of testing. So that's a good one there. And another question just came through from Tara. This probably might be the last one or maybe the second last one. Is there a preferred way to attach documents to emails for accessibility? I know they can be either attached or included with a link in the email, etc.
Both of those are fine. If you are going to link in the email, the key thing that you want to do with that link is make sure that the link itself is descriptive. So the biggest difficulty that we run into with links is people copying and pasting a really long URL. And especially as a screen reader user, if you have to try and listen to that URL, which is all one word with no spaces between it, and the screen reader is trying to pronounce all of those words, it can be really difficult to know what it is you're actually getting to. Even as a sighted user, you might look at a really long URL and go, I have no idea what this is. So if that URL is changed to be, let's say you're sending someone a health report, if your link says health report, you know that you're going to get a health report. If your link says www.health.gov.au/report/blah, blah, 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 it's going to, you can work it out, but it's not as instantaneous. In terms of attachments, attaching to an email is definitely noted. So when a user opens the email, it will mention that there is an attachment and there is the ability to go in and download that attachment. Obviously, if you're looking to make it accessible, then the document itself needs to be accessible. But otherwise, there's no major difficulty with attaching a document or including a link, as long as the link is makes sense.
Thanks, Alex. Another question just came through. Are there good resources for checking contrast of colors used in documents?
Yes. So the best tool to use is, it's just called the Color Contrast Analyzer, and I can actually just do a really quick, I'll just swap over screens, but I'll do a really quick demonstration of what it is and what it does. So the Color Contrast Analyzer is a free tool that allows us to basically pick up any color that shows up on our screen. Sorry, I lost my buttons. Okay. So I'll just do it on my background here, but the Color Contrast Analyzer gives us a little color dropper that magnifies the cursor and gives you a single point that you can click on. So if I wanted to know whether there's enough contrast between these two umbrellas, I can pick the blue. Then for the background, I can pick the green, and it will show me the color of those two pieces of text against one another. And it also provides results based on the minimum contrast requirements to meet a AA standard, as well as giving me the explanation of what the color contrast requirements and size requirements are. We can also use the tool to go in and actually adjust colors. So if you have a corporate color palette, you can type your colors in and see the results in RGB, HSL, and HSV. And you can synchronize the values so that you can adjust that color to try and see how much that color can change in order to still comply with the standards that you're looking to use. And I believe that there's still a link for that through the Vision Australia website.
Yes, there is. So yeah, it's on the Vision Australia website or the TPGI website. You can download this tool for Windows or Mac on those websites. And I believe that's all the time we have for. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session. I hope you all enjoyed. Just to let you guys know, sometime likely next week, we'll upload a YouTube recording of this session, and we're going to have, fully done captions on that as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a lot. And I'll see you all on the next webinar.
Thanks, guys.